Greetings, everyone. My name is Bridget Cabrera, she, her, hers, and I'm the Executive Director of Methodist Federation for Social Action. MFSA is over 100 years old, and our mission is to mobilize, lead, and sustain a progressive United Methodist movement, energizing people to be God's agents of justice, peace, and reconciliation. And we are so excited to be co-hosting this series of webinars with our partner, United Methodist for Kairos Response, UMKR. A few announcements concerning our conversation today. We invite you to please continue to keep yourselves on mute during the conversation. This will help with everyone's ability to hear each other and in particular to see our speakers. Our webinars are a place to learn, engage, and be in community together. In order to create an equitable and brave space, we do not tolerate any hate speech on our conversations. We are recording the webinar, and that recording will be shared in the coming days. You can access that either through UMKR or MFSA on either of our YouTube channels or our websites. And as you have questions, you don't have to wait to the end of the webinar or for a particular Q&A portion to type those in. As you're thinking of your questions, go ahead and type them into the chat box. And we ask you to refer those questions to John Wagner, who's going to be helping us get those questions to our moderator. Now, closed captioning is automatically generated, so do expect to see spelling errors and other errors, as that is just the computer putting all that stuff up. So thank you for being here, and we welcome John Wagner.
Hello, I'm John Wagner. I'm a co-chair along with Lisa Bender of United Methodist for Kairos Response. We have been around for about 10 years. We are engaged in nonviolent actions like divestment and boycott and many other activities to support Palestinian Christians who have called us to action in this country and around the world for peace and justice. So that's our mission, and we're so glad to have you with us. There will be contact information posted in the chat for UMKR, so you can get in touch with us, as well as the Methodist Federation for Social Action. I would like to introduce now our moderator for this webinar, Teresa Basile. She's one of the founders of United Methodist for Kairos Response, has been with us the whole time as our communications director, is also on the board of Friends of Sabile North America, FOSNA. You'll hear a little bit more about that later, and has been active in this area for many, many years. So I'll introduce Teresa now.
Thanks, John. And it's great to see everyone here. Thank you for attending, and especially thank you to our wonderful panelists for giving their time and joining us here today. We're going to be hearing from them shortly, but first I'd like to introduce the subject of this webinar. On October 19th of 2021, 6 highly respected Palestinian organizations were designated by Israel as terrorist organizations. The Israeli government claimed that the groups had tie to the PFLP, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and were channeling money to that group. It's a group that Israel considers to be a terrorist organization. Initially, Israel said the designation would not apply in the occupied territories, only in Israel, but I think it was in November they expanded that. They issued a military order for the West Bank with the same declaration about these 6 groups. This is a very dangerous situation. This designation could have terrible consequences for these groups, especially in light of the drastic counter-terrorism legislation that Israel adopted in 2016. And also, of course, in light of what that terrorist designation would mean to governments around the world if they believe Israel. Let me tell you about the 6 groups, very briefly, all 6 of them that have been designated in this unprecedented way. Al-Haq is one of the oldest and most prominent human rights organizations in the Middle East. They have notably provided crucial information for the ICC, the International Criminal Court, to enable them to start investigations of possible war crimes and crimes against humanity by Israel. Adamir was founded 30 years ago and is one of the leading prisoner advocacy organizations in Palestine. They provide legal and advocacy support to Palestinian political prisoners in both Israeli and Palestinian prisons. Defense for Children International Palestine, DCIP, is an independent Palestinian child rights organization dedicated to defending and promoting the rights of children living in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip. DCIP documents and exposes grave human rights violations against children, provides legal aid, and advocates on their behalf. Those are probably the three groups that many advocates around the world know best. There are three more that have been under attack that also do absolutely vital work. One of those is the Union of Agricultural Working Committees. They support Palestinian farmers and rural communities in Area C in the West Bank, which covers 60% of the West Bank, and it remains under full Israeli control. And Israel is trying to maintain as much control over that territory as they can. The UAWC supports Palestinians' struggle to remain on their land and resist Israeli home demolitions and forced displacement. The Bisan Center for Research and Development is a progressive civil society organization that seeks to enhance Palestinians' resilience and to contribute in building an effective democratic society. The center aligns itself with the poor and the marginalized in their struggles to achieve their rights in the context of national liberation for Palestine. The Union of Palestinian Women's Committees is a feminist, progressive organization striving to build a progressive, democratic society without any form of discrimination and with justice for all. So those are 6 extraordinary groups. I will soon have a question for our speakers, but now let me tell you about them. Sahar Francis has been the general director of Adamir Prisoner Support and Human Rights Association since 2006. She's an attorney by training, and she joined the association in 1998, first as a human rights lawyer, then as head of the legal unit. She has over 16 years of human rights experience, including human rights counseling and representation. She has served on the board of Defense for Children International Palestine, and she currently sits on the board of the Union of Agricultural Work Committees. I think it's noteworthy that I just named 3 of the 6 organizations there, so I think Sahar may have the unique distinction of having worked for 3 of these 6 groups. Jonathan Kutab is a co-founder of the Palestinian human rights organization, AHAC, which is one of these 6 groups, and also of Nonviolence International. He is an international human rights attorney practicing in the US, Palestine, and Israel. He headed the legal committee negotiating the Cairo Agreement of 1994 between Israel and the PLO. After he received his JD at Virginia Law School, Jonathan practiced for a couple of years in New York and then returned home to Palestine and became a resident of East Jerusalem. Today, he serves as executive director of Friends of Sabeel North America, FOSNA. Brad Parker is senior advisor for policy and advocacy at Defense for Children International Palestine, DCIP. He specializes in issues of juvenile justice and grave violations against children during armed conflict and leads DCIP's legal advocacy efforts on Palestinian children's rights. He also co-leads DCIP's No Way to Treat a Child campaign, along with AFSC. Before joining DCIP, Brad worked as a legal advocacy coordinator and staff attorney at Madre, an international women's rights organization. So once again, welcome to all of you. Thank you again for being with us on our panel to help us better understand Israel's attack on these 6 organizations and to put it in the context, the broader context of Israel's lawfare campaign against Palestinian civil society. So my first question for you is this. We know there are hundreds of NGOs throughout historic Palestine doing all sorts of admirable work, and much of it work that Israel would not be in favor of. Why these 6 organizations? Why has Israel mounted this rather ferocious attack on these 6 groups? Sahar, I'm going to put that to you first, and then our other two panelists can follow you.
Thank you, Teresa, and thanks for this great opportunity to be with you tonight. And I should highlight, as you said in your introduction, it seems like the six, but actually we should take in consideration the Israeli practice against the Palestinian civil society is not a short-time policy, but it started as old as the occupation itself. And there's a very a good connection to the political context. I should remind ourselves with the attack against the Palestinian NGOs in the 90s after the establishment of the Palestinian Authority, for example, in East Jerusalem, where Israel insisted to force that there's no presence for the PA no matter what in this side of the city, and they closed the Orient House, they closed the Damir office and the DCI office that we were initiated in the 90s as NGOs based in East Jerusalem, registered under the Israeli law at that time, and they kicked us out of the city. And this attack against the civil society takes different forms. As I said, depends on the context on the ground and much of what's going on, the fight, the resistance that the civil society is leading. So what happened in the last couple of years, there were a smear campaign led by Israeli right-wing NGOs like the NGO Monitor, the UK Lawyers for Israel, Im Tirtzu, Shurat Adin, and lots of other groups that they were looking into what these human rights and humanitarian aid and the Palestinian civil society organizations are doing, especially on the changing on the international level about our language, about our demands on the level of accountability, the kind of work we are involved in, the campaigns we are doing, the boycott, divestment, and sanction campaign, the fact that we approach the ICC, and so on. This is what made the difference, and they started to attack us and distribute false information about us, and they wanted to dry our resources. When they failed with all these efforts, they came to try the legal use of the Israeli anti-terror law of 2016. And it happened that they claim, as they claim, they have now more evidences. These evidences actually is about confessions that were gathered by Palestinian detainees under interrogation. And it's a long story about how interrogation is implemented in the Israeli detention facilities. And it should be also highlighted that it will not stop here. So part of it is definitely related to our daily work, in, as you described, in protecting farmers in Area C, launching cases to the ICC, defending children and reaching the Congress in order to affect policymakers and so on. And it will continue. It will continue against other civil society organizations if they are threatening the interest of the Israeli state.
Thank you. Brad, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, just a brief comment, and also just to say thanks for having me, and also to note that it's pretty ambitious to invite 3 lawyers for a 1-hour webinar. So we'll do our best. I think on this question, why these 6 organizations, the point that Sahar made, that this is, there's really nothing new, right? It's sort of that this has gotten more attention sort of in the context that it landed, and I think the ability in the networks that the organizations are connected to push back. Several months before the designations came against DCI Palestine, Ademir Al-Haq and others, health work committees was in the crosshairs. Civic institutions in East Jerusalem were in the crosshairs before that. So it is sort of an ongoing attack against Palestinian civil society. I think for us, we saw sort of a significant targeted escalation against DCI Palestine starting back in 2017, after we, had some success with congressional advocacy, particularly in the U.S. I know I've worked with Sahar and Ademir on international criminal court advocacy over the years, and engagement there as well with Al-Haq. And I think it's the rising international awareness of ongoing Israeli crimes and sort of a shifting political context in multiple locations, including in the US, where, AIPAC, which used to be a very bipartisan, kind of unchallenged entity, is now very much a GOP aligned partisan outfit, where there's been a lot of shifting, I think, under the surface of the political framework, not just in the US, but elsewhere, that then sort of leads to these escalations. We've had significant threats to us from private actors, and as the Israeli government has become increasingly right-wing, you see those private actors that those things that have been happening start to meld and sort of just become part of the government positions and the government attacks. So as we continue our efforts to expose crimes and hold individuals accountable, right, the attacks and the seriousness of the attacks have escalated side by side those efforts.
Mm-hmm. Jonathan, I'm going to ask you if you want to chime in. I kind of want to sum up what I think I heard, that in some ways my question was framed poorly, because actually there are many other groups that also have been targeted, and for many years. But also these 6 organizations are doing a particularly good job of bringing the world information about the human rights violations. And I'm guessing that you've been particularly powerful in your work and have earned the particular ire and attention of Israel for that reason. Jonathan.
Yeah, I just want to add one simple thing, is that Israel likes to do things legally, which means that they will pass a law which gives great power to the government, and then leave that law on the book. And they don't implement it, obviously, because under military orders existing today, almost any political activity in the West Bank, or any public activity, or almost any contact with any Palestinian official, you have to remember that the Palestinian Authority itself is composed of all these terrorist organizations. That designation has never been removed. But they just leave it on the books, and they use it when and if they need. The second thing that point that I want to make is that Israel feels that it has basically won. It has won at every level. The only thing it has to worry about now are these pesky civil society organizations that keep raising things like human rights and international law and public opinion. And so we go after them. Right now, the only battle that Israel feels it has to fight is the PR battle. And that is being led by civil society, whether it's in the occupied territories or in the outside world. So if the outside world is using BDS, even though it's clearly a nonviolent tactic, then we go after them and we criminalize it and we make it anti-Semitic, and we pass a new definition, the IHRA definition of what anti-Semitism is, and make it illegal, make it criminal. We delegitimize those who are trying to expose us and delegitimize what we are doing. So expect more, not less, of this type of activity as we move forward.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Thanks, Jonathan. Somewhere in there that raised the question for me of the evidence against these groups, that what Israel claims it has in the way of evidence to prove any kind of tie to a terrorist organization or funding to it. And there have been more than one demand, I think, by the 6 organizations individually or collectively to see that evidence, and Israel's refusing to show it. There have been news reports by people who have who have had some access to it, saying that it's very weak, weak sources, and but we don't know a lot of details about it. And I'm wondering what you all can tell us that you know about the evidence and your view of it. Yeah, anything you can share with us about this so-called evidence would be great. Oh, and I'm sorry, I'm going to call on Brad to get us started. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure. And I can pass the Sahara after here. I can be brief. I mean, I think the bulk of the so-called evidence is NGO monitor reporting, and sort of over the years that's become branded by the Israeli government through the Ministry of Strategic Affairs, which is now sort of part of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Right, so it's those allegations that we've been dealing with, and that disinformation that's been created by NGO Monitor and others, right, is I think still sort of the foundational pieces of it. And what's changed is that there's government sort of stamp of approval on that, and some additional pieces that have been brought in from forced confessions and testimony that looks credible from sort of a far gaze, but once you sort of investigate and look at it more closely, really it all falls apart. And I think that's what we've seen over the past 8, 9, 10 months as this effort escalated with European governments over last summer, working to delegitimize and discredit our work. Overwhelmingly, European governments found the so-called evidence just not credible, and I think that's still the case. I think on the evidence, right, the problem is the more that the evidence that's being peddled around at the moment isn't received to achieve the ultimate impact of having financial institutions, donor governments, etc., stop funding, right? I think that the concern is that, well, Israel can use the powers of the state to essentially not need evidence, just detain, arrest, torture, get confessions. And we've already seen this in certain cases where that's the norm. Administrative detention, right? It's another tool that Israel uses to essentially create a fact that seems more likely that somebody is engaged in something unlawful, right? To sort of create facts that then they can use to enhance the so-called evidence they have. So I think those are the concerns, kind of where things go forward. But the core of the evidence is very, very weak and really has been discredited over and over.
Great, thanks, Brad. And you got into some of what my next question was going to be, so I'm going to segue into that as I go to Jonathan. The history of this campaign against your groups and others, not just what happened in October. You talked about, Brad talked about cases that were brought in Europe, charges that were brought and investigated and found to be unwarranted by European entities, governments, or other agencies. But there's been a lot of other types of harassment that have happened, and I'd like to hear from all of you about that. Raids and personal harassment of personnel. But first, Jonathan, can you speak to the larger picture of this, the history of these kinds of campaigns of lawfare?
Yes. At Al-Haq, we've had a number of our members and employees, especially the field workers, as well as the executive director of the organization, at one time or another denied travel or was arrested administratively. Never any actual charges or military court, but there is some kind of secret evidence that they have some relation with one or another of the different Palestinian factions, all of which, as I mentioned before, are supposed to be illegal. And what happens in an administrative detention, actually, there is a procedure for challenging it, but it's such a total kangaroo court because there is no charges and there's no evidence. And you can challenge it, and then you say, what do you have to say? Or what can I say? I'm innocent. I've done nothing. What are you charging me with? So, well, we can't tell you that. That's secret. What are the charges? What is the evidence? What are the arguments? Are all in secret. You can challenge it, but your challenge is meaningless. I understand that recently, the over 500 administrative detainees now have decided they will no longer participate in this charade. What they have done instead, they've used hunger strikes, which is like, I'm not going to eat until you let me out or until you try me and tell me why I am in jail. And of course, we've had heroic efforts by people to demand that they be charged and tried or released. And the last person, Abu Hawash, 141 days. He lost half of his body weight. I don't think he will ever be whole again. It's so painful to look at something like that. And you must understand, this is not just a number of organizations or individuals. This is an entire society that is living subject to administrative measures, whether it's deportation, administrative detention, house demolitions, travel restrictions. All of these can be applied arbitrarily against any person, and there is really basically no due process and no recourse.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Jonathan, for that larger framework. That was really helpful. I'd like to find out now from, especially from Sahar and Brad, and also what any of you can say about the other groups that aren't represented here. What have been the repercussions, the concrete reactions you've gotten from around the world, both positive and negative? I guess it'd be great, maybe start with the negative and you can close with any positive responses you've been getting. Sahar, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I think the only negative reaction so far was in the case of the agriculture work committees, Union of Agriculture Work Committees, that the Dutch government decided to suspend the special security company. In this case, concluded that all these allegations of many I think the reaction, especially on the level of the international UN different groups, the political side, lots of other governments, they were all supportive, and especially after receiving the dossier, the secret dossier that the Israeli government represented, and they were saying that it's not sufficient evidences, and they decided to continue to support. But the problem here, and it should be highlighted, how long these governments, including the United States, would wait for another information or another proof from the Israeli side before actually taking a very clear position, telling the Israeli government, this is not accurate, not sufficient, we are not going to respect your decisions, and we are not going to stop coordinating, supporting, and funding these organizations. And maybe just to end in a very important point about the jurisdiction, we're all not discussing the point, who said if there's any proof or allegation of misuse of fund for a Palestinian organization that is registered under the Palestinian Authority, that the jurisdiction should be for the Israeli security and the Israeli military court in investigating such cases. If there's any allegations for mismanagement or misuse of fund of these organizations or any of the civil society organizations, it should be dealt with the Palestinian law under the Palestinian Interior Ministry and not the responsibility of the Israelis. So the whole point actually that the Israeli occupation is trying to build a case where it would be a precedent as well in order to be used against all those that they criticize Israel, or they're trying to seek accountability in the international level, especially on the ICC or via PDS or other peaceful tools that we were developing in the last decade.
Excellent, thank you. Brad or Jonathan, anything more about the responses you've gotten from around the world? Negative or positive?
I say that I think on the positive side, that the overwhelming solidarity and, you know, the reaction initially by folks that like this is politicized, this is targeting legitimate, lawful human rights work, and humanitarian work. I think we've been dealing with these allegations and sort of all of this disinformation and for so many years that the significance, I think, is lost a bit. I remember the day the designations became public. We were renovating our house, and I was driving to southern Vermont to pick out some tile and different things. And as everything is sort of flooding in, just thinking like, this is ridiculous, this is crazy, how is this possible? And then it sort of settled in as you start getting phone calls from folks, but there was a really positive reaction. A lot of the staffers in Congress and members of Congress themselves, reached out to say, like, what's happening? How are you? How's everybody on the ground in Palestine? Like, what do you need from us? So I think the testament to the relationships and the impact of the work that our organizations do, that's really what's seen by people. And then the repressive tactics to silence and eliminate that work, right, are very clear. Like it's what an authoritarian regime would do, and that's exactly kind of what we confront in our work in the Israeli authorities. So I think it's been, in the short term, that's been a really significant push. And I think Jonathan was saying this before we started to some degree, that, I think that response helps to pause, the escalations that are likely to come. But it's where the international solidarity and sort of pushback and really standing by the organizations and Palestinian civil society more broadly is hugely important and significant, because I think that's going to be the thing that determines, how much harm comes of this, maybe solely beyond kind of what governments do or not. I think it's really comes down to what people are willing to step up and speak out on and push back on.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I'm going to move to another question, if that's okay, Jonathan. One thing I'm wondering very specifically is, Israel made it clear, they were pretty transparent about this, that one of their biggest purposes in doing this was to limit funding, to make it very difficult for your organizations to keep your flow of funding coming in internationally. Some people have the perception you're doing just fine, and you're just full steam ahead with all of your work. Is that true? Is your work being hurt by this? Has your funding been hurt? Any practical repercussions for you?
Not so far, but there's a very realistic possibility that Israel may order the Palestinian banks to freeze the accounts, that they may physically come in and confiscate the equipment, like they did with DCI before they announced these 6 meetings. They simply just came in and trashed their headquarters and took out their computer equipment. but they can do that, I think, and they would have done that if there wasn't this tremendous international outcry. I think the importance of international solidarity cannot be overestimated. I think everybody on this call, I think, are contributing to making it harder for Israel to take specific actions against these 6 organizations, at least for the time being. And we have to be careful. We have to know that this may change very quickly once that level of interest and support falls down, then they will move ahead against all these organizations.
Yeah, okay, Sahar, can you share also in practical terms what has been the impact of this on Adamir's work?
I totally agree with Jonathan about what he said. The worst is to come. We like the whole solidarity campaign maybe caused that they are not raiding physically our offices and freezing our accounts and so on. But specifically on the Damir level and for a bit as well for DCI, our legal programs, our legal representation, representing detainees and prisoners in the military courts and the civil courts, and the visitation program to the detention centers and prisons were affected because lawyers are not able anymore. Actually, they're continuing their work as private lawyers, but not as representatives of Damir, because by itself, it would be a crime act according to the Israeli military orders and the Israeli anti-terror law by supporting illegal entity and a terrorist group. So for some point, it started to affect the physical work. In the case of other organizations, like I said, OAK, that they do offer services for farmers, they would be more affected as well and not being able to freely access Area C and hotspot areas as they used to be before. But we're expecting that this could be more deteriorating in the coming few months if really the pressure is not leading to the revocation of the decisions and canceling totally the orders.
So the worst is yet to come is what I'm hearing both of you say. Brad, do you want to add to that? What has the impact been on DCIT?
I think it's consistent with what both Sahar and Jonathan said. The tangible, concrete impacts, like we haven't seen them yet. But the possibility that bank accounts could be seized, frozen, right? Office could be closed. All of that could happen at any moment, essentially. And I think the impact so far, while they haven't been drastic and damaging, it does take a toll. With my colleagues in Palestine, the fact that they work with a designated organization now under Israeli and military law, all of this is a concern. People have families, kids, homes, all of these things that everybody has all over the world that they rely on that paycheck and job to help provide. So the uncertainty, I think, is all part of it. It's what's meant to chill relationships that we have internationally, and it's also meant to sort of put some doubt and chill relationships internally with the organizations, and I think we're seeing that play out in the short term. We'd be naive to think that an escalation isn't going to come at some point if we're able to weather the storm that we're in now.
Right. Thank you. Well, that brings me to what I thought would be my last question, but I'm going to go into this now, and then we can look at a bigger picture of lawfare. I'm really wondering, what do you need in the short term and the long term, need from us? I think most of the people here and a lot of other people around the world need and want a way to be of help. And One of the ways that some of us have started doing it is with political actions, petitions to heads of government here in the US, the president, the Secretary of State, contacting our members of Congress, asking them to speak out. We even have a piece of legislation, House Resolution 751, introduced by Betty McCollum, denouncing this action by Israel. Has a few sponsors. US government certainly hasn't spoken out in any strong way. They've been basically silent. And although the European Union, I think, has affirmed its support for Palestinian civil society, no individual European government has come out in opposition to what Israel's done. And so what more can we do? What do you think of those political actions we've started, and what else can we do to make a change in this situation for you? Yep, Sahar, I'll shoot that to you.
I think it's a very, very needed efforts, what you just described, and it should be expanded more and more, and we should keep the pressure. The pressure on the political level is very essential, because we, as 6 organizations, we know that we have nothing to look into the legal procedures internally on the Israeli system, whether in the civil system or in the military court system, like appeal and petitioning the High Court. I'm not so optimistic that we can cause canceling these orders by exhausting the internal remedies. And this is why it's very, very important, the political pressure on the international level. So keep your campaign and intensify it with the Congress, with the State Department, and every side that you think in the United States can make difference. And I think we should start thinking about the ways how we can influence as well the banking system decision making, because this would be very dangerous and very threatening in the future. Even if states don't take positions, I'm afraid that the banks would start to withdraw, and they will start stopping transactions because they will fear all the to be involved in facilitating funds for terrorist organization. It would be a base for illegal sue, and we're expecting that the pro-Israeli groups and the different groups that they could support the Israeli state in their position, they will start initiating such legal actions against international entities, international donors, or banks in order to terrify them. At the end of the day, as you said, the main purpose here is to draw our resources in order to silence us.
Thank you. Brad, how about you? What do you think, in addition to what Sahar has brought us, what can you suggest we need to be doing?
Yeah, I mean, it's, the particular context is difficult, because I think there's a lot we need to do, but the audiences that we need to act don't want to listen. So creating the sort of momentum to force the change that we need, and I think empower the organizations and really a broader Palestinian rights movement to be able to force change is what we've been focused on. The House Resolution 751 condemning the designations is the goal of that was to create a vehicle that could channel organizing and advocacy and activism to help boost numbers and explain and show the issue that we're facing with lawmakers in the US. There's been similar efforts in the UK, in Parliament, and some other locations too, where lawmakers are stepping up to help with vehicles that will show that support. And I think those efforts are really important to push back on kind of the broader narrative, right? I think what we're facing is that really anybody can be labeled a terrorist anywhere. discredit them. Like we're seeing that increasingly throughout the global context, and this is an example of that. I think it's also important in advocacy and in work around these designations that it's integrated into a broader sort of strategy, and as an example of Israeli authoritarian policies towards Palestinians, right? This isn't sort of a one-off thing that's just kind of a bad luck for us. This is part of what an Israeli government is that rules over Palestinians, denying them basic rights, not just in the occupied West Bank, but throughout Israel as well. So I think explaining that, showing that, and using it as an example of exactly what an Israeli authoritarian regime is doing, it helps really show the broader kind of picture of what Israeli policies are toward Palestinians. And I think talking about it in that way and situating it as an example of that is something that gives it a trajectory in life, whether we survive or not. It's sort of piece of this broader picture that is important. And I think what will be the point of change.
Excellent. Thank you very much. That's wonderful. And Jonathan, do you have anything to add to that about what we need to be doing? You've become executive director of one of the major organizations in the U.S. now for Palestinian rights. So where do you see this going?
I have three letters for you. BDS. International organizations, groups, individuals must bring nonviolent pressure on Israel to respect human rights, to respect international law, to respect Palestinian lives. And I think we need to challenge the friends of Israel everywhere. Is this really what you are, what you want to be? Is this really who you are? And if it's not, you either change your behavior or stop pretending you are in any way a democracy or an enlightened society or a respected member of the community of nations. Unfortunately, this is the only thing that we can do, and it's actually good. We need to use pressure, moral pressure, ethical pressure, political pressure, and we need to start with friends of Israel everywhere we find them, that this is not acceptable behavior. And you cannot carry out this type of behavior, not just against these 6 organizations. As Brad says, this is part of a larger issue. Is this going to be the nature of Israel for the future? Have you accepted that you will be doing what you want and disregarding the international community? Do you accept your position as an apartheid regime that's oppressing another group? Is this what you want to be for the rest of history, or do you want to change? And can you bring about change? And change is required. And Israel should not be allowed to have an easy, free ability to continue with this oppression unchallenged.
Fantastic. Jonathan, I'm going to stick with you for a minute. First of all, let me tell everyone we're going to go a little bit past the hour, maybe 10 minutes past the hour. And very quickly, we're going to get to at least a few of the questions that you all have been sending in to us. But we did want to look a little bit at what's happening to some others in Israel and Palestine with this kind of lawfare assault. In particular, perhaps Mohammed El-Halabi in Gaza, the former director of World Vision's work in Gaza. They were bringing urgently needed humanitarian aid to the 2 million people who are locked into Gaza because of the now 15-year-long blockade of the Gaza Strip. Can you say a little bit about his case and what has happened to him and what his status is now, and what we might be able to do for him, if anything?
In a way, this case is both unique and typical. It is unique because this one person decided that he is not going to take a plea. He is not going to give them the privilege of saying, I violated the law. I did not violate the law. I did not pass any money to Hamas. I did not do any of these things that you are claiming against me. And he did it in Israeli civilian court. This was not a military court. For 167 sessions, they have failed to present any evidence. They kept referring to secret evidence that the lawyers themselves were not allowed to talk about. The lawyer who's from my office, Meher Hanna, in Jerusalem, was not allowed even to prepare his summation on his own computer. He had to do it on the prosecutor's computer and to simply read it in court without even keeping a copy for himself. This is in a civilian court. He's been in jail for over 5 years when he could have been released from the first year if he had accepted a plea and if he had accepted responsibility for what he did not do. He says, I am not a terrorist. I did not pass any money to Hamas. This is all bogus. This is not true. And now they are stuck. They don't know what to do. They don't want to admit the mistake that they have done. They want to find him guilty, but there is no proof on which to find him guilty. The court ended 4 months ago, submitted the final summation 4 months ago, and now last week the judges say, oh, your summation is too long, you need to contract it and reduce the number of pages, and you have to do it, of course, on the prosecutor's computer when the prosecutors are free to allow you to use their computer. And so I don't know what the judge will do in the end, but this is a really case of the utter lack of justice in the Israeli justice system when it comes to issues pertaining to Palestinians. So we don't know what happens. We hope something good will come out of it, but our past experience has not been very good. There has been no proof. 165 sessions, no public evidence that can be shown to anybody, and the lawyer is not allowed to talk about how terrible the evidence there is that was presented in secret.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And I'm thinking it's a particularly intractable situation he's in for us to have an impact on. However, there is I just remembered a petition on change.org.
Yes, there is.
I don't know, and you could say, Jonathan, I don't think it's officially put out there by FOSNA, but I happen to know as a local FOSNA leader, at least, to
yes, FOSNA did start a petition and collected several thousand
here it is.
Signatures on it. We had a campaign about it. I think we're going to probably revive the campaign. We were waiting for the decision of the court, and now the decision is being pushed back even further. So we'll probably do some more petition on behalf of Halabi. But remember, Halabi is only one. And in fact, he is unique because he's not under administrative detention. He's under a regular court, not even a military court, a civilian court in Israel. But because he's a Palestinian and he's accused of something relating to security, there is absolutely no justice being provided to him. That petition is still on, and we will be collecting more and reviving the whole campaign on his behalf soon.
Fantastic, thank you. All right, and I put the link for that petition in the chat for folks. Also, a little farther up are some other resources that you all might like to look at, and I would particularly point out to you our page under Find More Resources. We're going to be adding more to that page after this webinar. So we'll keep updating it about what's going on with this situation with the 6 organizations. I want to move now to some of the questions that we've been getting from people, and there are a lot of them. We're only going to get to a handful at best. So I will ask You actually all have been doing very well on being succinct. I'll just ask you to continue that so we can cover as many questions as possible. This is something Brad touched on a little bit already. Very good, very broad question. What implications might this have for human rights organizations in other countries and affiliated organizations? And I think maybe that means affiliated to you all, or you can interpret that as you like. What implications might this have for human rights organizations in other countries? Sahar, do you have any thoughts about that?
I think it would be like, as Brad was describing, if Israel claiming that it's the only democracy in the Middle East, and they allow themselves to designate 6 prominent Palestinian organizations based on secret information without allowing due process. Can you imagine in like other states how they will react? And this is why the special rapporteur on the UN level was alerting that there is a misuse of the anti-terror laws in this case by Israel. And it could be used by other undemocratic states and authoritarian regimes, of course. And this is why we think that if you allow such thing to pass, this means it will be very easy used in other contexts, in other conflicts, in other wars against anyone almost in the world under the name of security based on secret information without allowing individuals or organizations to defend themselves. And of course, on the level of partner organizations or any organization that works with us, it should be clear that all the time that you are not present in Israel or in the occupied territories, Israel cannot implement their own law over you as an American in the United States now. So I don't think they can run after you as an American citizen sitting in the United States. I know there is loops and lots of, and this is what they will try to do all in the coming. The more time pass, the more time they will discover the ways how to trace us and our supporters, I'm sure. But I mean, the first things would be used against the international organizations that are based here in the occupied territories or in East Jerusalem or inside Israel, that they keep supporting us and working with us, because it would be the easiest way how to attack supporters.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. That's very good. Brad, can you flesh that out a bit more? Do you see other implications in this for human rights work and organizations in other parts of the world?
And I think, coming from a more American perspective on the response or lack of response from the U.S. government, right? I think the global impact of that, it sends a significant message. When the U.S. didn't come out and condemn this move, immediately or in the first few days, I think that sends a very strong message and at least tacitly gives a green light to these same repressive tactics being replicated in, a number of different contexts where opposition groups or political actors can just be kind of labeled as terrorists and, imprisoned, charged, or not charged, right? But removed from sort of the public sphere. So I think there's already been trends where that's sort of increasing globally. And I think the US sort of role here in not condemning has a significant impact in sort of setting significant obstacles for the realization of human rights globally because of that lack of response and condemnation sort of. So I think that's a really kind of big takeaway. And then I think on the more narrow level, the lack of a response one way or the other from the U.S. government is troubling too. And I think creates a situation where if the evidence isn't strong enough from the US perspective to come out and be aligned with Israel on this, it gives an opportunity for Israel to create more evidence that would be amenable to the US government to come out and be aligned. So I think that's where, you know, the real concern for escalation, for arrests, for interrogations, things like that become, you know, a really clear next step if Israeli actors so choose. And then I think on the, you know, thinking about partner groups in the US, again, as Sahar said, like the designations are under Israeli law and now the military law. So they are in many ways firmly constricted to those jurisdictions. However, we've you know, had people, American citizens, Palestinian Americans that have been affiliated with the organizations at some point being stopped by Customs and Border Protection as they come through the U.S. in transit, being asked questions. You know, so it's not necessarily true that U.S. government has no position. You know, if people are being stopped and interrogated at airports, that's something. So it's trying to get a sense of what the sort of ramifications are on that front. But I think at the moment, there's no sort of prohibition or bar under US law that would prohibit anybody from engaging with the organizations. You know, granted that could change if political decision by the Biden administration, you know, moves forward in one way or the other. But that's the context, I think, from my end.
Thanks very much. And Jonathan, do you have a perspective on this, the impact globally?
Yes. I think, as Brad says, the war against terrorism and the international cooperation in fighting terrorism and anti-terrorism legislation that exists in many countries is all now going to be weaponized to work against human rights and to work against civil society. If there's enough pushback, it won't happen, or it won't happen right away. But they can also use the other tool, which is the IHRA definition, so that if they can't actually criminalize you as a terrorist, they can label you as anti-Semitic. And you spend all your energy and resources fighting that charge and trying to prove that you're not anti-Semitic, rather than carry out whatever good activities that you want to be carrying out. So it is, in a real way, it is a global fight. And I say this as a person who has believed in human rights for a long time. Human rights are universal. International law needs to be applied across the board to everybody. You cannot carve out an exception for Palestinians. And if you don't do that, then you are cheapening and reducing respect for human rights and for international law generally, and ultimately for people's rights, even in the United States, as we see with the anti-BDS legislation that's being proposed here and there. It is really actually weakening U.S. laws and U.S. freedoms and U.S. ability to act as a civil society in order to safeguard what Israel wants.
Thank you. Someone else has asked about what's happening with the ICC, the International Criminal Court. And the question says that several Palestinian organizations, let me see if I can get this right, are representing plaintiffs against Israeli officials at the International Criminal Court. This is clearly a threat to Israel. How are the cases before the ICC proceeding? Also, are Adamir and DCI Palestine lawyers still able to access Palestinians imprisoned by Israel? We heard a little bit about that. That's two very different questions. How are any ICC cases you know of progressing, and how are your own attorneys faring?
I'll start on the ICC. I think Israel and the United States are both pressuring the ICC to go slow and not to proceed with these actions. In fact, the ICC is going much slower than people would like. The United States has made it clear that it is going to, at least under the previous administration, that it would punish those who bring those actions at the ICC, would even punish the prosecutors and the judges. It would prohibit them from getting visas into the United States, may even arrest them, may even freeze their bank accounts. So there is a real attempt to silence the International Criminal Court itself if it proceeds as it is proceeding, although slowly, to move against Israel. I'll let Sahar answer, because on the lawyers, which I understand the answer that she gave already, I think is satisfactory.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. I think I already explained that in both our cases, DCI and the Damir, lawyers can represent detainees under their capacity as private lawyers, and they do so. So they couldn't be banned from being present in the court or in the doing the visitation in the prison, because they will do it as individuals, as private lawyers, not as representatives of these two organizations.
Mm-hmm. Okay, very good. You know what, we're at 8 minutes, almost 9 minutes past the hour now, so I think we are going to need to wrap this up, and I'm sorry we couldn't get to more questions from our audience, but actually, as I was looking through them, it seemed like a number of them did get answered along the way. So I hope many people heard the answers that they wanted to know. One thing that was mentioned was if there is any place where there is a collection of all church statements or faith-based organizational statements about this, we are collecting those, and you'll be able to find them at that same resources page for this issue, Stand with the Six, on the UMKR website. So keep checking back on that page. Yeah, I think that's it for us now. And I am just so grateful to the three of you for giving us all this time and staying even past the hour. You, I think, have helped a lot of people understand better what's happening there, and motivated us to stay the course and not forget about this issue, and realize that, as Jonathan and others pointed out, there's going to be more to come, and Israel isn't going to let this drop. We need to be vigilant and keep supporting you. So we will not let this die at UMKR. Thank you so much, Sahar and Brad and Jonathan. I'm going to pass this back now to Bridget Cabrera, who can tell us about the next webinar we have coming up.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to drop a couple links in the chat for the next webinar, the Doctrine of Discovery webinar that we have going on with UMKR and NIAC. We'll be having our fourth webinar in that series next month. The information's in the chat. It's on February 9th, and we'll be focusing on the theme. I can move my cursor here and look at it. The theme centering and othering, elevating white normativity and suppressing racial and indigenous identities, how the doctrine of discovery has perpetuated those themes, what that looks like today. And so I really hope you can join us. And I know that we will also be having another webinar with UMKR in March. So be on the lookout for more information on that. Thank you, everyone.